Welcome to Better Health Guy Blogcasts, empowering your better health. And now, here's Scott, your Better Health Guy. The content of this show is for informational purposes only and is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any illness or medical condition. Nothing in today's discussion is meant to serve as medical advice or as information to facilitate self-treatment. As always, please discuss any potential health-related decisions with your own personal medical authority.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 213 of the Better Health Guy blogcast series. Today's guest is Dr. William Davis, and the topic of the show is supergut. Dr. William Davis is a cardiologist and #1 New York Times bestselling author of the Wheat Belly series of books, and more recently, Supergut. Recent human clinical trials that Dr. Davis conducted have revealed that it is possible to lose fat and weight while preserving muscle, thereby preventing weight regain and enjoying improved body composition. Dr. Davis is also Chief Medical Officer at Realize Therapeutics, which he co-founded to explore the new science of the microbiome to improve health and appearance, including body composition. In part 1 of our talk in episode 213, we will talk about the microbiome, about several beneficial organisms, as well as about prebiotics and polyphenols, and the mucin layer. And then in part 2, in episode 214, we will talk about SIBO, SIFO, and about creating the supergut yogurts, which I'm just beginning to do myself. And now my interview with Dr. William Davis. I personally have struggled to optimize my microbiome after having been on several years of antibiotics for Lyme disease nearly 20 years ago. I'm excited today to shoot the poop on the topic of the microbiome with Dr. William Davis and to explore his book, Supergut. Thanks for being here, Dr. Davis.
Oh, my pleasure.
You say in the book, I won't kid you, righting the wrongs of your intestinal microbiome can be physically and emotionally challenging. You will be wielding the microbial equivalent of a sword, hacking off heads and limbs, taking back several feet of territory that used to be yours, but that are now unruly, chaotic, and serving another master. So let's dive in.
It's an awful lot of drama, isn't it?
I love that. What are some of the key health challenges that people experience today that have at least some contribution in the realm of a less than optimal microbiome? What percentage of chronic illnesses are rooted in the microbiome? And then are there specific symptoms that commonly are associated with microbiome dysregulation? And what are maybe some of the common contributors that result in a microbiome that is not optimally health supporting?
You know, over the years, I've concluded that it's at least half the population with chronic disease. Scott, at least half. I think more towards 90% that have a major role in the microbiome. But people would say things like this, but I don't have any gas or bloating or diarrhea. I must not have a gastrointestinal source of my problems. Not recognizing that issues like cognitive impairment and dementia, coronary disease, weight gain, type 2 diabetes, autoimmune diseases, other neurodegenerative disorders, skin rashes, eczema, psoriasis, rosacea, panic, depression, suicidal thoughts, sleep disruption, insomnia, nightmares. These are all, at least in part, a reflection of a disrupted microbiome. We have done a real number on our gastrointestinal microbiome, as you know, from a whole long list of factors that starts with excessive exposure to antibiotics and so many other things in modern life, from processed foods and their additives like preservatives and emulsifying agents that have major effects on your microbiome. Glyphosate, even though it's not been properly documented, is likely a very big player because it's an antibiotic and it's everywhere in our air, skin, hair, urine, blood, babies, umbilical cords, everywhere. But that's the sad part. The good part is that if you recognize this, you're at least getting started on the path to getting control over this disaster we've created. One of the things I see people really struggle with, though, is we've spent a century engaging in this antibiotic model of medicine. That is, if you have a problem, kill it. If you've got pneumococcal pneumonia, kill it. Kill the pneumococcus. If you've got high blood glucose, drop it with a drug to force down blood glucose. If you have high blood pressure, give you a drug to force down high blood pressure. That's a flawed model. It has its place, has its role in specific situations, but it has come to dominate all of healthcare. And so we have now a system that does not understand that there are other ways to manage health. And that's where the microbiome can play a big role.
It's amazing, too, how many people are taking things like NSAIDs or PPIs, thinking that maybe they have too much stomach acid, when in reality, they probably have too little. And those things certainly don't contribute to a healthy microbiome either. Many people experience gastrointestinal conditions such as ulcerative colitis, Crohn's, IBS, IBD, SIBO, which we'll dig deeply into later. Wondering if all of these conditions are really suboptimal microbiomes, and is the real issue the lack of beneficial flora? Is it an abundance of pathogenic flora, or is it a combination of both? And then kind of extending on that, we hear people talk about bacteria all the time in reference to the microbiome, but what about fungi and viruses and parasites? Can those also be potentially beneficial? Are we maybe focusing too much on just the bacteria?
Yeah, sadly, Scott, as you know, we focus on bacteria, to some degree fungi, a little bit on archaea or methanogens, and there's so little known about viruses and bacteriophages, viruses of bacteria, that it's almost impossible to construct any kind of practical advice for viral. It may turn out. So this is why I try to get people to get away from the thinking of, if you see something you don't like, let's say blastocystis, that's a parasite, kill it. In other words, more often than not always, but more often than not, let the microbiome do it for you. So one of the greatest insights, I think, into what a microbiome should look like, a gastrointestinal microbiome. And by the way, as you know, there's a vaginal microbiome, an airway microbiome, a urinary bladder microbiome, skin, mouth, brain. All these locales have their own unique microbiomes that we have, to varying degrees, disrupted and experienced thereby all kinds of health problems. So what I've been seeing, I believe, is by restoring some, if we've lost, let's say, 500 species of bacteria and other microbes, we don't have to purposefully identify each and every one and replace them. That would be impossible, right? Thankfully, there's a wisdom built into the microbiome. And what I think I'm seeing is restoration of selected species seems to do the job for you. Now, maybe in 10 years, you'll say that was dumb and there's a better way to do it. But right now, what I'm seeing is restoring certain keystone microbes seems to have a big effect. So the one I've been playing with, of course, most of all is Lactobacillus rhodori, as well as Lactobacillus gasseri. And those two, as well as some sporulating species like Bacillus coagulans and Bacillus subtilis, these are microbes largely absent from most modern gastrointestinal microbiomes. When you restore them, they have a unique effect in the small intestine. There's been a lot of focus on the colon, but I think a lot of the battle is in the small intestine, the 24 feet of duodenum, jejunum, ileum. And because we've been overexposed to antibiotics and all those other things, those species I mentioned are very susceptible to common antibiotics, Rhodori, gasseri, and those bacillus species, especially the two lactobacillus species. Well, those are microbes of the small intestine as well as the colon. Most microbes stay in the colon, that's where they belong. These microbes inhabit the small intestine as well, where they take up residence or sporulate in the case of bacillus species, and produce bacteriocins. These are natural antibiotics that kill fecal microbes for the most part. Well, why is that important? Well, I believe in over half the US population, because of all the factors we talked about, preservatives, antibiotics, fecal microbes have been permitted to overproliferate and then ascend into the small intestine. You can recover them during endoscopy. You can find fecal microbes in the duodenum on endoscopy. And there's testing you can do, like hydrogen breath testing. You can use it to map where microbes are living. And lo and behold, I thought this was rare, Scott, until this device, if you know about this device, the air device, Yeah, you blow into it, talks to your smartphone, 0 to 10 hydrogen gas. Microbes produce hydrogen gas, we do not. And you can use it as a mapping device to tell you where microbes are living. And lo and behold, when I started having people talk about this and consider it in about 2018, 2019, I thought this problem, this small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, the infestation of the small bowel with fecal I thought it was rare. And what I saw instead, that it was extremely common. I now believe that at least half the US population has this problem. And it's a tough little bastard to deal with. But when this happens, it's a very unique situation because the small intestine is not equipped to handle trillions of fecal microbes up from the colon. Because when they do that, it inflames the intestinal wall. The small intestine is normally very permeable, but when it's housing all these trillions of fecal microbes, it becomes even more permeable, and those microbes die, and they release their toxic components that now enter the bloodstream, a process called endotoxemia. But that tells you how, and that goes all throughout the body. But it tells us how microbes in the GI tract, but specifically in the small intestine, can be experienced in the brain as anxiety or depression or cognitive impairment or Parkinson's disease, or in the skin as rosacea or psoriasis, or in the heart as coronary disease or atrial fibrillation, or in the uterus or in the prostate or in, you name your organ, there's probably a role for the microbiome. Not to say that all disease is caused by it, of course not, but it's a big player in almost every chronic disease that we're familiar with, like diabetes, overweight, heart disease, dementia, et cetera.
Funny enough, I first learned about Lactobacillus reuteri from a medical intuitive probably close to 20 years ago. And she was pointing out at the time how critical that was. And I probably should have paid more attention back then.
Wow. That's impressive.
You talked about a lot of other biomes, the nasal biome, the respiratory biome, certainly the oral biome. From your perspective, should we be focusing on supporting those biomes as well? Should we be thinking about, I know now there's compounded lactobacillus nasal sprays. What are your thoughts on the importance of supporting the biomes outside of the gut?
Unfortunately, that science is so preliminary, Scott, it's hard to know. There are exceptions, though. The vaginal microbiome is proving to be so important. Thankfully, it's much simpler than the gastrointestinal microbiome. So a lot of modern ladies have lost a very crucial microbe called Lactobacillus crispatus. And if they lose it, it allows these unhealthy species to proliferate. These are often fecal species or Gardnerella and Adipobium, weird microbes, but responsible for loss of sensation, discharge, irritation, and premature delivery of a child. Because when you lose crispatus and those other microbes take over, there's inflammation of the cervix. And if a woman's pregnant, it can cause premature relaxation of the cervix and deliver a child prematurely, which can be catastrophic. For older women, ladies 65 and older, sometimes younger, typically experience vaginal atrophy, pain, discharge, dryness, loss of libido, repeated urinary tract infections, incontinence, urgent stress. A woman sneezes or bends over or has any kind of abdominal pressure, and she wets herself. Very embarrassing. The conventional medical solutions are awful for all those things. Well, crispatus may play a big role in all those things when it's restored. And one of the wonderful things about crispatus, Scott, and the vaginal microbiome is it was thought a woman would have to introduce it as a suppository, which is offensive. And it has some risk. You're introducing things when you do that, including fecal microbes. That area is full of fecal microbes. Well, now it's clear a woman can take a microbe like Lactobacillus crispatus or Lactobacillus reuteri, which also colonize the vagina. A woman takes it orally, and it colonized the vagina. Well, how? There's no connection. There's no rectal vaginal connection, but it does. No one knows how. Maybe it's by contiguity, nearness in the groin, the perineum. But even more remarkably, once it colonizes the vagina, it then colonizes the bladder. This thing we thought was sterile for ever since forever. And so a woman can take it orally and it colonizes all those organs and has dramatic effects. both for the reproductive age woman and also for the postmenopausal woman, and of course, every year in between. And interestingly, Crispatus, the dominant, and some other vaginal microbes are also dominant microbes in a female's skin, not a male's skin, but a female's skin. And it plays a major role in maintaining youthful skin. Isn't that cool? So skin's also very interesting. We've goofed that up too. We've allowed Staphylococcus aureus, that common pathogen, to overproliferate and outmuscle Staphylococcus epidermidis, a friendly microbe. And there's a variety of reasons for that. Our overuse of antiseptic type preparations, antibacterial soaps, shampoos, toiletries, antibiotics, of course, a disrupted diet. The dietary guidelines have done untold damage to human health. And even though they won't retract the garbage they pass as dietary guidelines. And one of the things that was never focused on, I hope in coming years they will, is the effort to purposely feed the microbiome in your gastrointestinal tract, because that's how they feed your skin. So if you get sufficient fibers in your diet, not cellulose fiber like bran, but fibers from vegetables like jicama and legumes and vegetables. And by the way, one of the few fibers that comes from animals, hyaluronic acid from organ meats, very important fiber. Well, you get those fibers, it blooms specific species in your gastrointestinal tract, like Akkermansia, Fecalibacterium, Lactospiraceae. Those are microbes that produce butyric acid, fatty acid. Well, that fatty acid does wonderful things for your overall health, including reduce blood sugar, reduce blood pressure, shrink abdominal fat, give you deeper sleep with vivid dreams. But it also goes to the skin and acidifies the skin. Healthy skin is acidic, a pH about 4.5. Unhealthy skin, in someone with acne, eczema, seborrhea, psoriasis, rosacea, has less acidic skin, about pH about 5.5. Well, the difference between 4.5 healthy, 5.5 is tenfold. It's a logarithmic scale. And when you have a less acidic skin, it allows the proliferation of that Staphylococcus aureus. So we get those fibers, we bloom species that produce butyric acid, it acidifies the skin, it shifts the balance away from Staphylococcus aureus and towards that favorable epidermidis, and you get smoother, healthier, less blemished skin and less prone to all those skin rashes. So the skin microbiome, very important, but it's largely determined by your diet and what goes on in your gastrointestinal tract. So on and on and on. Well, problem. There's a major disruption of the oral microbiome. But what do we do about it besides dental hygiene? That's of course a good step. Well, I would say don't eat wheat grains and sugars, because they bloom unhealthy species that cause cavities and other problems. But what if you have Porphyromonas or Fusobacterium? These are species that tend to proliferate if you have any amount of gum disease, bleeding gums, gingivitis, periodontitis. And my fear is that when that happens, it's very tough to get control of. Mouthwash does not work, by the way. You use mouthwash, you kill off the microbes transiently, they come right back because they're hidden in all the parts of the mouth and the gum crevices. And so mouthwash is a very damaging thing to do. So there's probably a hygiene issue here, but also no one's actually developed the formula for how to manage the oral microbiome. And that's a real concern because those oral microbes can be retrieved from the sinuses and the brain in people with dementia. So I think where this is all heading is that in order to get control over such things as dementia, colon cancer probably starts in the mouth. That Fusobacterium mentioned that proliferates in the mouth gets into the bloodstream when you floss or brush any micro trauma, and it colonizes the colon, where the evidence is pretty good. It is a driver of colon cancer. So while the gastroenterologists are just scoping people from below, left and right, and saying, you're good, you don't have polyps, go get lost, they failed to say, well, let's talk about your oral microbiome. Let's see if you have Fusobacterium nucleatum. And then let's do a stool test, see if it's transplanted itself into your colon. Because if it has, we got to do something about it. So this is all unfolding at rapid pace, but a lot of the therapeutic, and of course, there are companies who are eager to make a buck, coming out with products that are maybe they work, maybe they don't.
So a few things then based on your comments. You talked about wheat and the oral microbiome. I've heard that it also leads to a wheat belly. No pun intended, but we gotta put a plug in there for your other top-selling book. The ability to use an oral probiotic to support the vaginal microbiome is certainly a good thing. I wasn't sure if you were going to tell us there was another application for your yogurt that maybe would not have been so good. And interestingly, when we talk about the skin, in the SIRS landscape, or chronic inflammatory response syndrome, the work of Dr. Richie Shoemaker, there's a focus now on actinobacteria, P. acnes, and Corynebacterium tuberculosteric, and how those that are on and under the skin can be triggers for systemic chronic inflammation. So it's an interesting thought that we can maybe work to improve our skin microbiome as well as a way to potentially outcompete some of these other pathogenic organisms. I want to get a little bit of your thoughts about how do we test for these things? Are we looking at a GI map or a GI effects or a gut zoomer? Or are you more likely to look at something like Tiny Health or Thrive or Ombre? Biome is certainly popular. Which ones do you feel like give us the most accurate and actionable information?
Scott, I've taken kind of a practical approach to all this because stool testing is a science of limited usefulness. One of the problems we have is when you submit a little sample, it's a rectal sample. It's not an ileal sample. It's not a ascending colon sample. A friend of mine, Dr. Raul Cano, he's a microbiologist who 40-year academic career at Cal Polytech in San Luis Obispo. And he and Martha Carlin did something. They have a foundation called the BioCollective Foundation. They did something extraordinary. They collected the entire bowel movement, not just a rectal sample, but entire bowel movement of 1,000 people, submitted to analysis and compared it to rectal samples, and found that the rectal sample had almost no resemblance to the whole bowel movement. So we have to accept that rectal testing is a tool of limited usefulness. Not to say you shouldn't do it. So I've taken this kind of approach, and I don't know what the solution is. Should we have gastroenterologists insert a scope and retrieve an ascending colon? Probably not. So what I've done is this. Let's do some basic things to presumptively restore what we think is a better microbiome. Let's restore lost keystone species, not all species, but keystone species. Make sure you get lots of fermented food. The magic of fermented foods like kefirs, kimchi, fermented pickles, all those things, is the microbes of fermented foods like Leuconostoc mesenteroides or Weisella species or Pediococcus species don't take up residence in your GI tract. You consume them and they don't take up residence. So this is the work of the Sonnenbergs, Erica and Justin at Stanford. They did a very elegant study that showed that people who ate lots and lots of fermented foods with those microbes, something happens and you see a bloom in beneficial species. All those ones I mentioned, the Fecalibacteria, Akkermansia, Lactospiraceae, Lactobacillus species. It's like saying, if I planted tomato seeds in my garden, I got a bunch of cucumbers. How? So no one knows how that works. Maybe there's small numbers that are quiescent or sequestered in the mucus barrier. No one knows why this happens. You get these fermenting species that don't take up residence, and they somehow cultivate, like farmers, the proliferation of beneficial species. And so that blooms diversity. And of course, the fibers and related compounds that feed these things. And if you do all that, as well as remove the things that disrupt the microbiome, common things. Choose organic foods, minimize your exposure to herbicides and pesticides, filter your drinking water so it doesn't have pharmaceuticals, chlorine, or fluoride. Avoid ultra-processed foods with all the garbage they have, like preservatives, like sodium benzoate and potassium sorbate. Avoid emulsifying agents like polysorbate 80 and carboxymethylcellulose. No one has to memorize that, by the way. Just means a return to real food. The stuff you grow in your backyard, stuff you get maybe at a farmer's market, maybe organic foods, real foods, and you've minimized all those disruptive factors. If someone does that and they say, my rosacea went away, I'm sleeping. My skin looks like I turned back 10, 20 years. I don't have any bloating. If they accomplish that, there's probably not a big role for that flawed stool testing device. But if you do these things and you say, well, I'm a little better, but I'm still having a lot of diarrhea, or I'm still testing for positive H2, or I'm still seeing fat malabsorption in the toilet, or I still have fibromyalgia, that's where I see maybe there's a role for stool testing in its current form. And I would advocate those tests you mentioned, like Thrive / Ombre, Tiny, the ones that give you a more deeper look into the DNA, so it gives you a more thorough look at the microbes. I would never submit Biome because it's non-quantitative. So if it says you have, let's say, Clostridium difficile, very bad to have. Well, but lots of people have Clostridium difficile and it's just kept at bay and doesn't bother you. Or is it about to cause hemorrhagic gastroenteritis and you could die of it? You need to know how much you got. So if it's a non-quantitative test, it's not of much value, and that's a non-quantitative test. Those other ones that are kind of the older forms, the GI map, GI effects, so they can be helpful too. You just don't get some, not all of them. You don't get some of the deep dive into your species. So in other words, some of those will say, you've got lactobacillus. Well, which one? Jensenii, NCI, Gasseri, Rotari? There's a lot of those kind of things. So I would favor those ones that go deeper, the Thrive, Ombre, Tiny.
I think that's a great perspective. I know one of my mentors, Dr. Dietrich Klinghardt, has always said that particularly if we're looking for parasites, but I think other organisms as well, the ones that are coming out in the stool are probably the weak, dead organisms, and the ones that are thriving inside of us, they don't want to come out. They're gonna stay there in their happy place. Many people listening to our conversation have numerous food sensitivities. Some are down to a handful of foods, which itself is a slippery slope. One client that I had years ago was down to one food, and that one food was alligator, and she had to get it shipped in from Florida. When people are universal reactors to foods, is the problem the food, and how much does microbiome restoration increase tolerance?
I've seen with almost uniform certainty, it's all SIBO. That is, the mechanism not quite worked out, but it's probably the microbes that have infested up in the duodenum as well as jejunum and somehow incited some kind of sensitivity. Great grandma or even grandmother, they had none of this stuff. There was no such thing as, there was occasional food allergy, but not these food sensitivities where people eat a nightshade or FODMAPs or histamine-containing foods or whatever, and they get sick. Bloating, diarrhea, asthma, skin rashes, mental, emotional effects, all that kind. These are unique to our time. What I've been seeing is people correct their SIBO, and typically within 4 weeks, sometimes longer. Some people have SIBO really bad with a history like yours where you took antibiotics for years. They may have to take steps to eradicate SIBO that takes months, but then they can reintroduce. I've seen this almost 100%. You can reintroduce in small quantities those offending foods, and you now tolerate them just fine.
Let's talk a little bit about the connection between the microbiome and metabolic syndrome, glucose, insulin. You mentioned diabetes earlier. So when we start restoring the microbiome, do we see improvements in hemoglobin A1C, fasting glucose, fasting insulin? Talk to us about the connection between metabolic health and the super gut approach.
Well, so that SIBO or just colonic dysbiosis may play a role. It's not that science is not well sorted out, Scott. How much of a role is dysbiosis confined to the colon play versus SIBO, small intestinal involvement? Because very few studies actually separate those two. But it's my belief that a lot of it is SIBO, it's small intestinal involvement. Not to say that colonic dysbiosis doesn't have its own implications. You can get colon cancer or diverticular disease or ulcerative colitis from colonic dysbiosis. So the colonic composition of the microbiome is important. But I think most of the time when you have metabolic consequence like you're talking about, I think it's from the small intestinal involvement where you have that endotoxemia. So we know with good science, starting with Patrice Kenny's work, 2006, 2007 in Belgium, he was the first one to finally formally validate this process of endotoxemia, showing that it's a major driver of insulin resistance. And for your listeners who don't know this, insulin resistance is the major driver of abdominal fat, hyperglycemia, high blood glucose, and so many other diseases, all driven by insulin resistance. Now, there's other factors also. Loss of some microbes. Some microbes consume sugars. So Martha Carlin, my friend, is a big fan of Lactobacillus plantarum, which is a really cool microbe, by the way. You can get it from food, you can get it from fizzy drinks that we make. It's one of the few microbes that occurs in the soil, water, food, your body. And Lactobacillus plantarum is really good at consuming sugars. So it consumes glucose, fructose, sucrose, thereby reduces those levels in your GI tract and then in the bloodstream. So there's that also. Now, all these things we do, whether it's Gasseri or Rotari or Plantarum or prebiotic fibers or fermented foods, also tend to lead to a loss of abdominal visceral fat, major driver of insulin resistance. So there's that too. There's several other mechanisms, but it's a broad and substantial effect.
Let's talk then about the connection between the microbiome and depression, anxiety. These are so common. Is there a role for beneficial organisms to potentially serve as psychobiotics? And could a focus on the microbiome to support mental health be more effective than the many prescribed medications that we see today?
So that process of endotoxemia rears its head once again. There's a German group that this is the reasoning this group took. They said, there are people with depression who are given SSRIs, antidepressant medication. Some respond, many do not. And that's a mess of a process. If you get put on an antidepressant, the psychiatrist or GP says, come back in 2 or 3 weeks. You come back and say, it's no better. I'm still depressed. I'm still suicidal, right? They increase the dose. Come back again in a few weeks. You're still feeling awful. They change the drug. You come back, you still don't feel good. This can go on for months, if not years. So it's an awful process. So this group asked, and others have asked, what's different between the responders and non-responders? And it looks as if the non-responders have higher levels of inflammation markers, C-reactive protein, interleukin-6, TNF-alpha, all that stuff. So they thought, well, what's driving the inflammation? So they did something extraordinary, Scott. They took that endotoxin, that lipopolysaccharide endotoxin from endotoxemia, took normal, non-depressed volunteers and injected them with it, which I always cringe when I hear that, because if you miscalculate the dose a little bit, you kill them. You kill people with it. It's a very lethal thing. So you inject a little bit of endotoxin, and within 3 hours, these people all were clinically depressed and had MRIs that showed all the hallmarks of depression. They did this study twice. So it suggests that endotoxin can be a major driver of depression. Of course, there's more to it than that. There may be specific microbes that play a role. Our friend Lactobacillus rotari, I would not say is instrumental for preventing depression, but it is instrumental in provoking the release of oxytocin from the brain. Oxytocin, the hormone of love and empathy and human connectedness and sociability and acceptance of other people's opinions. But that's not depression, but it's part of well-being. So just restoring rotari can do it. There are probably, but this is just emerging, there's a handful of microbes that may have more direct effects on the brain. So there's some evidence for Bifidobacterium longum and Lactobacillus helveticus. I'm a little skeptical that's true. I, for instance, cultivated those 2 microbes and it made me depressed. So I'm a little bit skeptical that it's quite that simple. But it may be, one of the things we don't know is how microbes interact with each other. There is some evidence, but we don't really have good evidence. So a good illustration of that is if mom gave you a microbe as you passed through the birth canal or with breastfeeding or with contact, you'd have that microbe for a lifetime, barring exposure to antibiotics or your mom getting exposed to antibiotics. Of course, we all get exposed to antibiotics and other factors. But if we restore, let's say, Lactobacillus rotari or Lactobacillus gasseri or Bifidobacterium infantis, we restore it by yogurt or probiotic, we restore it maybe for 5 days, 7 days. Well, why? Why is it such a probably, no one knows for sure. It's probably because we lack the community. we say the guild or consortium of microbes that support those microbes. So I think, who knows, 5 years from now, 10 years, I say, Scott, listen, if you want Reuteri or Gasseri or other microbe take up permanent residence, get it with these 6, 8, or 10 other microbes, and it will support its long-term residence. But no one knows what that looks like right now.
So many people with chronic illness look for nutritional or nutrient deficiencies through various tests like the Nutrival or the Vibrant micronutrient test. And I'm wondering, does improving the microbiome improve our absorption, assimilation of nutrients? And does a healthy microbiome itself produce many of the nutrients that are necessary for optimal health that we could be deficient in?
Yeah, I see a lot of the supplements people taking are really deficiencies generated by a disrupted microbiome. So, for instance, homocysteine, which is a marker, particularly over 14 millimolar per liter, that's been associated with increased risk for depression, heart disease, and cancer. Well, we now have 8 very good clinical trials where people are given doses of folate or folic acid, vitamin B6, B12, sometimes riboflavin, and it reduces homocysteine. But no one has a reduction on those events. So what's the disconnect? Well, I would propose homocysteine is probably a marker for dysbiosis or SIBO, because it's the microbiome that produces all those B vitamins. So the microbiome is responsible. There are microbes that produce vitamins B1, B2, B3, B5, B6, B7, B9, B12, and others like K2. And so how about ladies who are told to get folic acid from grain products so they don't get spina bifida in their children? Well, folate is a microbial product. So time and time again, we've intervened with some supplement. And the real problem was not the lack of the supplement, it was the disruption of the microbiome that was supposed to be producing that nutrient all along. So that's a big deal.
I mean, and that's very interesting because we see in a lot of people with SIBO that thiamine or B1 can really help them symptomatically. So to your point, if the microbiome is imbalanced, they then have reduced production of B1 that then leads to deficiency, and it's kind of this vicious circle. For many people that have been on long-term antibiotics like I was, it was almost 4 years. I, as you say in the book, have a microbiome only a mother could love. I was breastfed for 2 weeks, had many rounds of antibiotics for ear infections. Then I had 4 years of antibiotics for chronic Lyme disease. So wondering if you see people that have these multiple long-term assaults on the microbiome, can they restore the microbiome in the direction of health?
I do see that. Not to say that success is 100%. This is really an evolving set of practices. I don't have all the answers. I don't think anybody has all the answers. It's so new. It's like AI, right? There's going to be all kinds of changes and iterations and applications we haven't even foreseen. Same thing here. It's an evolving science and practical application. But I think we're getting a lot of great results with this very simple equation: restore keystone microbes, often as yogurt. Why yogurt? It's not yogurt. It looks and smells like yogurt. But fermentation as yogurt or other fermented foods is just a very easy way to amplify bacterial counts. So, for instance, we take Reuteri at low counts, and then we increase them typically 1,000-fold by making this yogurt, and then consume half a cup a day. And that has extraordinary effects. And part of the reason is because we're using very high counts of microbes. But I think we are seeing a lot of success. Not 100%. There are people who claw their way back and they say, well, I've lost 47 pounds and I don't have diarrhea anymore, but I still got a little rosacea and it won't go away. So, I mean, we're working it. But this is how this all can't happen for me, is always trying to ask, well, why? Why is this person not experiencing full relief from some problem? It started with like wheat belly, the diet, nutrients that address insulin resistance. And it became clear the hole in that program was the microbiome. But there's probably other things we're not aware of yet.
You talk about how modern people have lost many microbes. Oxalobacter is one, Bifidobacterium infantis is another. microbiome organisms that our ancestors had, and how it's even difficult for research to identify what those lost organisms might have been. So I'm wondering if you think that humans will evolutionarily adapt over time to no longer need those organisms that we've lost, or is there a way to restore them?
Nobody knows. There's a way to restore them, but it's not quite clear if that's necessary. So if we said, okay, we've had microbiome analyses via stool testing of the Yanomamo in the Brazilian rainforest, of the Bantus in Africa, of the Maasai in the savannas of Kenya, of people living in the jungles of New Guinea, the East African Malawi. We have those and other hunter-gatherers, people untainted by exposure to antibiotics. Well, they have very different microbiomes. And interestingly, of course, those people don't talk to each other. They don't have smartphones and they have no contact, yet they have microbiome composition almost identical to each other. So the presumptive conclusion from people who've done those studies is that it must represent the so-called Stone Age or prehistoric microbiome that you and I would have had if this was 50,000 years ago. So should we mimic that kind of ancient microbiome? Should we try to get more spirochetes? That's what they have. The only one of the rare spirochetes we have is syphilis. Should we have, they have more archaea or methanogens with no constipation? That opens some questions. They have much greater diversity. They all have rotari, by the way. And so it's not quite clear if that's necessary, or at least part of the composition of our microbiome is really an adaptation to modern life in some way that's beneficial. So that distinction, Scott, just not worked out yet.
Oxalates are a trigger for many people listening for mast cell activation syndrome. They can create a lot of pain for people. Some people start down the gluten-free path, not realizing that they're then increasing their oxalate consumption with almond flours and really digging a deeper hole. So I'm wondering, do most people have a microbiome that has an adequate level of oxalobacter to break down oxalates? And if not, how can we restore it? I know there are some countries that have oxalobacter as a probiotic. Is that potentially helpful? And if some of the oxalates that we have in our body are produced endogenously by fungal organisms, does balancing the microbiome indirectly reduce oxalates by reducing or eliminating the organisms that are creating them? And once we bring in the yogurts that we'll talk about later, do people ever experience an increase in oxalate dumping?
I can't address the fungal part. I've never heard it. That's very interesting. I'm going to have to find out more about that. But I think the conversation with oxalates is that it's becoming very clear that high levels of oxalate in the blood, in the urine, that can lead to oxalate kidney stones and other problems is really a microbiome issue. But there was lots of hopes that Oxalobacter formigenes lack was the culprit. That's proving not to be true. It's probably, once again, a consortium of Oxalobacter, one member of probably half a dozen microbes, mostly lactobacillus species. I can't name them off the top of my head, but it's because the current evidence suggests that those lactobacillus species have profound effects on reducing oxalates. So we've got to put together probably a yogurt recipe, only because if you can ferment, let's say 3 of those, co-ferment them, and then consume it, you probably have the capacity to dramatically reduce oxalates. The same kind of thing applies to uric acid, hyperuricemia. Hyperuricemia is gout and kidney failure, and a cardiovascular risk factor. High levels of uric acid is clearly a microbiome issue. And the great thing is, because the microbes that reduce uric acid work by different mechanisms of action, there's probably a huge synergy. My prediction is when somebody actually does the clinical trial with the right consortium of microbes, it's going to be better than conventional drugs to reduce uric acid.
You say in the book that we don't want to throw super microbes into a nasty snake pit with things like a microbiome that's tainted with glyphosate. You mentioned glyphosate earlier. We know that it has antibiotic properties that kill the beneficial organisms, but not necessarily the detrimental ones. So it seems to select to leave behind the species that are harmful. Wondering how we clean up the snake pit. Is it with detoxification? Is it elimination of glyphosate in the diet, which seems difficult, as you mentioned, to fully do? Or is it a combination of both elimination and supporting detoxification and supporting the microbiome?
Yes, yes, yes. As you recall, I use this analogy of a backyard garden because this is really tough for a lot of people. With all this talk of microbes and staphylococcus and leuconostoc and all that. So I tell them, think about it like your backyard garden in springtime. How do you have a backyard garden? Well, let's say you lay out a 10 by 10 plot. You're going to pick out the stones and the twigs and whatever garbage you might have there. You're going to plant seeds. Then you're going to water and fertilize it through the growing season. And then at the end of the season, you're going to harvest your tomatoes and cucumbers and zucchini. The microbiome is very similar. Let's prepare the soil. So let's get rid of as best you can. Foods that might contain glyphosate, choose organic, thereby minimizing other herbicides, pesticides. Filter your drinking water because chlorine, fluoride, and pharmaceuticals now in your water. Avoid processed, ultra-processed foods because of all the stuff that's in there, like preservatives and emulsifying agents and all kinds of other garbage and herbicides and pesticides. So there's a long list of things you can do. It's all in my Super Gut book, but it's all pretty much common sense stuff. But it all boils down to just going get real food, growing your own, going to the farmer's market if they can assure you it is indeed organic. Buy organic if you can, if it fits in your budget, at the grocery store, filter your drinking water, etc. The seeds are fermented foods are the first choice. Those are so powerful and so underappreciated, I think. Restore those keystone microbes. Right now, for me, it's Lactobacillus rhodori, Lactobacillus gasseri, and either Bacillus coagulans or Bacillus subtilis because of their benefits on small bowel colonization or germination and their capacity to produce bacteriocins. Those bacteriocins got extremely powerful. And that combination, rhodori, gasseri, Bacillus subtilis especially, covers a broad swath of undesirable we say gram-positive and gram-negative microbes, different kinds of microbes. I worry about that because what if your SIBO or even colonic dysbiosis is dominated by Proteus, E. coli, and Campylobacter and Pseudomonas? Well, the rhodori gasseri, real effective. What if it's dominated by Streptococcus, Enterococcus, Staphylococcus? Well, that's where the Bacillus subtilis or the coagulants can be helpful. They take care of the gram-positive guys. And so those three, there's going to be more, but those three I know are beneficial. Crispatus also for a woman. And by the way, there's very preliminary evidence that a woman who restores crispatus to her vagina, thereby bladder, will transfer it to her partner during sexual intercourse. And that may benefit prostate health. That's preliminary, but that would be really cool if that holds true. And then, so the water and fertilizer also includes those prebiotic fibers and related things. These are just things like jicama, legumes, black beans, white beans, kidney beans, leeks, dandelion greens, all those kinds of things with fiber. And that little formula has, for the most part, done the trick for most people. Now, but in the beginning, I encourage people to amplify the counts of those keystone microbes with our yogurt, using prolonged fermentation in the presence of prebiotic fibers. So in the initial recipe, we increased the counts of rhodori, for instance, 1,000-fold. And when we did flow cytometry on the yogurt, we get about 300 billion counts per half cup serving. That's hard to get as a probiotic. It would be very, very expensive, right? So making yogurt, this thing that looks like yogurt, is a way to get huge numbers of counts and gives you greater power, at least in the beginning. Maybe not long-term, but in the beginning it does.
Many people suggest that Bifidobacteria is one of the more important species to support our health. I know during COVID, Dr. Sabine Hazen talked about those with higher levels had better outcomes with COVID. I recently heard a lab director of a stool testing lab say that 90% of people today test very low for Bifidobacteria. So wondering what you found helpful for increasing Bifidobacteria. And then for those people that are low in Bifidobacteria, some of them have the genetic SNP, FUT, or FUT2, and wondering if there's any difference then in that FUT2 population when attempting to increase Bifidobacteria.
That I don't know. I'm not sure there is evidence on the FUT2 subpopulation. But getting bifidobacteria, one of the problems we run into is that I say, Scott, you need rotari, gasseri, bacillus subtilis, and you need Bifidobacterium longum, you need Bifidobacterium and several other Bifidobacterium species and some other species. Well, how many things can you ferment? So at some point, long term, or you have long COVID or some reason you believe that there's a severe deficiency of Bifidobacterium species, that may be a place where probiotics play a role, where you get, say, 4 species of Bifidobacterium. Now, you can ferment that too. Bifidobacteria is a very easily to ferment collection of microbes. Much as you do rotari, we're using 24 to 36 hours at human body temperature. Now, one of the things we don't know, though, we haven't yet done the analysis, is let's say you ferment 3 different species. Well, it's like, I once again use the backyard garden analogy. If I plant tomatoes and zucchini and watermelon and squash, at some point, zucchini takes over. It's a very aggressive plant. Same thing with microbes. We don't know because we're making the first batch from probiotic preparations, second, third, fourth, fifth batches from a little of a prior batch. And we don't know if there's a relative shift in numbers because it requires DNA sequencing and flow cytometry. We will do that. It's just very tedious and costly to do that. So, because if that happens, you can't keep on propagating the yogurt. You have to start over from scratch. Or what some of my audience has done is, let's say you're going to make a 3 microbe yogurt, ferment them individually and consume each. It's more hassle, but that way, if you say, I need to get Bifidobacterium longum or other Bifidobacterium, ferment it individually and then consume it individually.
And what I think I remember from the book was if it was a single organism that was being fermented in the yogurt, that should, in theory, be indefinite, that you can continue to take part of the previous batch and use that for the next one. But I think your recommendation was if there were multiple organisms, that after about 5 or 6 times, we probably should start over.
Probably, until we have better evidence. Yeah, this is how it's been done for generations. In yogurt making. This is how it's done in commercial manufacturing of microbes. And people say, well, if I grow rotari, will I have rotari? Well, it's like saying, if I plant tomatoes, will I get cucumbers? No, you'll get tomatoes.
Many of our listeners have chronic illnesses and benefit from coffee enemas to support bile flow, glutathione production, detoxification. Do you think there's any potential downsides of coffee enemas in terms of the impact to the microbiome? And is there a place for probiotic enemas in microbiome restoration, particularly with Bifidobacterium, which is usually more in the colon than in the upper gut?
I've strayed away from those kinds of ideas, especially the coffee enemas, because it falls into the category of treating things. I know that sounds weird. And in my programs, it's the hardest thing that people grab. I tell them, stop. There's sometimes a time and place for that. But for the most part, so for instance, to illustrate, people go on my programs and they start with being obese, type 2 diabetic, hypertensive with irritable bowel syndrome, and maybe Crohn's disease, let's just say. They do the program, wheat, grain, sugar elimination, handful of nutrients to target deficiencies and insulin resistance, address the microbiome with all the things we're talking about, maybe some other things. And they say, well, I don't have diabetes anymore. I've lost 83 pounds. I'm no longer obese. My Crohn's disease is gone. My rosacea is gone. We didn't treat those things. We addressed the factors that allowed those conditions to emerge in the first place. So as time has gone on, Scott, I've gotten away more and more from this idea of treating it with something. And so I can't really speak to the enema thing. I will say my friend David Perlmutter, the Grain Brain guy, he's a big fan of probiotic enemas, and he says he's seen. I know of no formal data. I get, fecal transplants, kind of that in a little bit in a way, but I've never done it. But you could argue that there's a time and place for that in somebody but I would reserve that, I think, for somebody who's just not responsive to, because it's not a very pleasant business to give, let's say, a child an enema, and hold it for as long as possible and maybe do that repeatedly. So I think that we need better validation, but it's an interesting idea.
Is it possible that some people become sensitive to their own microbiome, and that part of the challenge then in rebuilding the biome becomes that their own immune system is working against them, almost like an autoimmunity to our own microbiome?
I don't know. I've never heard that before. Yeah, I've never seen any evidence to that effect, but don't know.
How does the throwaway organ, the appendix, impact the composition of the microbiome? I think we know now that it's sort of a storage depot for different microorganisms. So if someone does not have an appendix, is there anything different they need to do to successfully restore their biome?
I know of no formal evidence to that effect. Likewise, this is not just unique to the appendix. It's unique to a lot of things. If you had partial bowel resection, colon or small intestine, there's not a lot of good evidence to tell us what to do there. Unfortunately, conventional medicine is probably a couple of generations behind in how to deal with these practical issues. And we have a lot of misinformation also, right? If you had your gallbladder out, you're told to go on a low-fat diet, which is disastrous advice. It's silly and it's completely unnecessary, and probably makes the situation worse because gallstone disease is probably at least in part SIBO, because you can, if you look at gallstones and you study them with DNA methods, not with culture methods, you'll get fecal microbes out of those gallstones. Now, wait a minute. The biliary tree is 24 feet up from the colon. How did fecal microbes from the colon get into gallstones? Well, SIBO, right? So I don't know of any formal evidence to do that, except to do what we're doing. If you've had partial bowel resection, if you've had gallbladder disease, if you've had any kind of pancreatic disease, if you have lack of an appendix, do all the things we're doing. Because I don't know any specific way to mimic the repository function of the appendix.
I want to come back to what you mentioned earlier, which was the bacteriocins, which are natural antimicrobials that are produced by beneficial lactobacillus and other organisms. This was one of the really interesting things in the book Supergut. Wondering if these bacteriocins have any negative impact on any beneficial flora, or are they entirely selective for pathogenic organisms? And do they stay in the gut, or do any of those have a systemic effect?
Good question. Don't know. So you're right that the bacteriocins produced by our friendly microbes are mostly effective in killing off unfriendly microbes, the E. coli, Campylobacter, et cetera. But they can suppress. So let's say lactobacillus produces reuterin or reuterocycline. Those are bacteriocins. They can also suppress or sometimes even kill off beneficial bacteria also. We're back to that idea of the collaborative guilds or communities. It's not quite clear how you can see how messy this can get. What if lactobacillus is not good for a strain of Fecalibacterium and a strain of Weissella? So this can get really messy really fast. But I think at the practical level, I think we're seeing dramatic effects by putting that phenomenon to work. That is recolonization of the small bowel and colon and production of bacteriocins. I think it's been a net positive.
One of your favorites, maybe your favorite bacteria, is Lactobacillus reuteri. You mentioned in the book that it's been eradicated in 96% of people in the Western world, which is really a stark and discouraging data point. Some of the benefits that you've talked about are the oxytocin piece, the desire for connection. There are some cosmetic benefits that you've mentioned, hormonal support for growth hormone and testosterone, helping to reduce endotoxin burden, helping to balance our stress hormones and reduce cortisol, helping with insulin resistance and inflammation. I mean, this just sounds like such a magical organism that we all really need and want. You talk about benefits on skin and hair as well. But one of the things I wanted to talk about is, as we age, one of the contributors to aging is thymic involution, in that our thymus continues to get smaller and smaller to the point that we then have immune senescence and can't respond well to pathogenic organisms. So wondering how Lactobacillus reuteri could support the thymus and immune system to minimize that immune senescence as we age.
Wouldn't that be cool if we could do the human clinical trial to validate that? So as you point out, this was done in mice. We're older mice. So As we age, as mice age, the thymus gland right here underneath the sternum involutes or atrophies, such that by age 70 in humans, it's about 10% of its original size and T cell producing capacity. And of course, T cells, the thing that mediates a lot of immune responses and cancer immunosurveillance. So we lose this thing. And of course, that's a big part of the reason why you can die of the flu or pneumococcal pneumonia at age 70, but not at age 18. Very uncommon at age 18. So in the mice, same thing happens over about their 2-year lifespan. The thymus atrophies over 2 years. While given reuteri, shockingly, the thymus was returned to its youthful state. Now, to do that in humans, I thought about that. We're doing clinical trials, but we do them slow and methodically because we're not pharma. We don't have billions of dollars obtained by ripping people off left and right. We're not going to do that. So we just do small little trial. We did a little mouse trial, a little human trial. We're doing another mouse trial. We're playing another body composition trial. We have several gynecologic type trials planned. So, but it takes us a long time because we just don't have that billions of dollars. And Elon Musk won't return my calls. So, so it would be a study like this, though, Scott. Do baseline imaging, say MRI of the thymus gland, do T cell subset studies, then engage them in reuteri or whatever intervention you want. And then maybe a year later, repeat the MRI and the T cell studies and see what kind of change we've had. It's doable. It's doable, but it would cost probably $10,000 per participant. And you can imagine if you had 100 participants, we're talking about a lot of money for us. So we probably won't do that study. But it's, you know what, as you know, Scott, in most instances, things seen in mice often don't translate to humans. Sometimes they do, often they don't, because we're not identical. But to my great surprise, everything seen in the original mouse studies, whether it's thymic involution, we haven't done that yet, but other things, so far has held true in humans. I did not expect that, but so far everything has held true. And we've learned new lessons not reported. It's hard to report quality of sleep and dreams in a mouse. So one of the things we've learned, for instance, and I've personally experienced, is a dramatic improvement in sleep and dream content.
They need to come up with an Oura ring for mice, and then we can at least see what their sleep is. You've talked about the benefits of weight loss. You talk about shape. You say that it's dramatic and effortless with the yogurts, but then there's also some discussion in some of the forums about increases in weight from increase in muscle mass. So wondering, do some people have to buy new clothes because they now have more muscle mass? And then what happens if they stop the yogurt in the future? Does that muscle mass then get lost and the fat returns?
You know, this is one of my really areas of interest, and that is what you're calling shape and body composition. It comes to a real important time because people are taking those stupid GLP-1 agonist drugs, the Wegovy, Ozempic, Mounjaro, all that stuff. Typical story. Let's say it's your wife. Your wife pays $12,000 for a year's worth of Wegovy. She loses 40 pounds, of which 10 pounds is muscle. She stops the drug because you say, we can't afford this forever. She stops the drug. She regains 32 to 34 pounds of fat in the abdomen, very little muscle. She's now more insulin resistant, more likely to be a type 2 diabetic or pre-diabetic, hypertensive, risk of coronary disease, dementia, and breast cancer, higher risk than she was at the start. Yet she paid all that money, and she'll likely die several years earlier. That evidence is pretty good. So, but it highlights the importance of preserving muscle. We lose about a third of our muscle just through aging. And if you engage in a GLP-1 agonist or a low-calorie diet or bariatric procedure, about 25% of the weight you lose is going to be muscle. And you've just hastened your fall into falls, fractures, frailty, loss of independence, and earlier death. It's an awful situation they've created. It's got horrible. So I did a little clinical trial in ladies. You know, one of the crazy things with my audience, 87% female. And we talk about these things and they say, you know what? We don't care about the empathy. We don't care about muscle. We don't care about thymic involution. And we just want better skin. And you and I say, what? Are you serious? So just to make them happy, I did a small clinical trial, 25 ladies, no placebo group, just said, don't change your diet, don't change your exercise program, just get, in capsules, combination of 40 billion rhodori. I threw in marine source collagen peptides and hyaluronic acid, because those two things absent from the modern diet, because we've been told to cut our fat, saturated fat and cholesterol. So most people abandon consumption of organ meats. Those come from organ meats. So I threw those in because both of those are also known to modify body composition. They shrink abdominal fat and restore youthful muscle. Not a big effect, but a moderate effect. And then I threw in astaxanthin, a carotenoid, because most modern people lead a carotenoid depleted diet because they're over reliant on processed, ultra processed foods. So I threw in astaxanthin. So those four things in capsule form, no change in diet, no change in exercise. Over 3 months, we did do something called high resolution skin ultrasound. It was a skin trial. And we recorded a marked increase in dermal thickness. Ladies were thrilled because they lost many of their crow's feet, smile lines, some of the deeper wrinkles started to recede, but they also lost up to 8.5 inches off their waist. I did not expect that. We just happened to do waist circumference because we only spent like $100,000 in this study, but so we can't do everything we want to. But waist circumference measured with the tape measure is free. So we did that. I get the data. Like, what the heck? So while I formulated that combination for skin, it also, I believe, proved to be huge effect on shape and body composition and a large increase in muscle. Personally, in my early 60s, many years ago, I gained 13 pounds of muscle and my strength increased by 50%. And Scott, I go to the gym 15 minutes once, twice a week because I hate it. Can't stand it. So, but I gained all this muscle doing it. What the heck? So I think we've stumbled, not intentionally, stumbled on a way to target abdominal fat and also maintain or even restore youthful musculature. Now, that's the next clinical trial we're going to get started, I hope, in a couple months. We're going to quantify all this kind of stuff, but I'm seeing it play out in real life. So when people say, I'm gaining weight, I say, good. Look in the mirror. They'll say, oh, my waist is smaller and my shoulders are firmer. My chest is. So I think that's what they're experiencing.
So it sounds like people do not experience an increase in waist circumference as they're gaining muscle. For people listening that are interested in your formulation with the rhodori, the collagen peptides, the hyaluronic acid, and the astaxanthin, I believe that's your Gut to Glow product that is available for people interested. The other primary lactobacillus organism that you talk about is the Lactobacillus gasseri, has 7 bacteriocins, those natural antimicrobials, colonizes in the upper GI tract. You talk about the bacillus organisms, these spores, Bacillus coagulans, which is also capable of producing a bacteriocin as well. Wondering if we can use others. You mentioned Bacillus subtilis as well. I know there are products that combine 5 different bacillus spores, like Megaspore Biotic. Has anyone explored making a yogurt out of that?
I don't think so. Kiran Krishnan, the founder of Microbiome Labs, we've been talking, and I don't think they ever made yogurt out of it. I will tell you, Bacillus coagulans is not the friendliest for fermentation as yogurt. We did a bunch of plate counts and, culturing them, and we didn't get reliable fermentation. That's one of the reasons why I shifted over to Bacillus subtilis. And there's 2 ways to do the subtilis. You can get Kiran Krishnan's, well, he left the company, but Microbiome Labs has the HU58 strain, and that will make yogurt. But we've also done this. You have a choice also, just making it into a sparkling juice, which is a lot of fun. So it's real cheap. Go to Aldi, go to Costco. There's kombuchas. Like at Aldi, it's called Vital Life, Vitalife, $2.19. And you get the DE111 strain of subtilis. You take maybe a half cup, pour it to any volume of juice. Just make sure the juice does not contain any preservatives like potassium sorbate or sodium benzoate. Cap, agitate, loosen cap, and then keep it at 90 degrees Fahrenheit in whatever device you have for 60 hours. And you have to leave the cap loose because it's going to bubble with carbon dioxide like crazy, which you might not want in a yogurt. But we're going to ferment it so that there's almost no sugar remaining, and you get super duper high counts of Bacillus subtilis. So it's a real easy way. It's a fun way because you drink it. So I'll ferment often like a mango passion fruit juice. And after that fermentation process, I've got sparkling mango passion fruit juice.
So you're using a capsule of the HU58 then in the juice, and that's essentially the process.
So the HU58 does not produce CO2, so we use that for yogurt. The DE111 produces so much CO2 that we use it as a sparkling juice.
What are the top and bottom foods and beverages that support or destroy our microbiome? What should we not be eating? What should we be eating? And then is there any negative impact of coffee or acidic beverages or carbonated beverages?
You know, those fibrous foods, not cellulose fiber, not bran, not breakfast, not that garbage, but fibers from vegetables like jicama, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, those things really do help. Legumes, the galacto-oligosaccharides, hyaluronic acid. Oh, we should talk about that. The hyaluronic acid that's ordinarily sourced from brain and skin and organs that most people have abandoned because we were told to cut our saturated fat and cholesterol. That hyaluronic acid is a spectacular fiber. It blooms those butyric acid producing species like Akkermansia and Bifidobacterium, and thereby provides all kinds of benefits on emotions, cognitive health, insulin resistance, skin. So hyaluronic acid, massively underappreciated as a major player, as well as restoring better skin because it provokes fibroblast production of collagen. It also increases the moisture content of the dermal layer of skin. So ladies love that plumpness, they call it, like kids have. And it also helps rebuild joint cartilage because it causes chondrocyte production of collagen and increases the synovial fluid, the lubricating fluid in your joints, and is the primary ingredient in the so-called glycocalyx lining your arteries that controls tone. And the brain is largely made of hyaluronic acid. Now, no one's ever done a cognitive study with hyaluronic acid, but I think it is one of the most underappreciated fibers. So the fibers, hands down, are so important. Not as important as fermented foods, but fibers are very, very important. And of course, we should not be eating sugary things. You know, sugar invites fungi. We haven't talked about fungal overgrowth. I think that's a largely underappreciated phenomenon. That is the overproliferation of Candida albicans, Candida glabrata, other Candidal and Malassezia and Cluveromyces species that overproliferate in the colon and then will also ascend into the small bowel in parallel with SIBO. So I think that's a common problem also. The thing I find fascinating about that, Scott, is people with fungal overgrowth will say things like, I have overwhelming sugar cravings. Now, wait a minute. Fungi thrive on sugar. Did fungi somehow evolve to produce a metabolite that tells your body, feed them? And then you address the fungal overgrowth, and it seems that the sugar cravings go away. So these fungi, I think, have evolved to produce some metabolite to influence your behavior.
It's interesting. One of the things that Dr. Dietrich Klinghardt does in the chronic Lyme realm in treating chronic infections is use hyaluronic acid first as kind of a bait to get some of these infections to come out before he then layers in the herbal antimicrobials. So yeah, lots of interesting things there.
Interesting thought.
Talk a little bit about beneficial flora, the need for prebiotics and polyphenols. These are essentially kind of like miracle grow for our biome garden. What are some of the prebiotics that are most microbiome supporting? Are we generally wanting to get these from food? Can we get them also from supplements? And then I'd love to hear a little bit about your favorites. I think many people hear about FOS and GOS and XOS. You talk about inulin, acacia. There's also the guar gum, PHGG. And then building on that, are there some that are better tolerated in people that are dealing with SIBO? I've heard that inulin maybe isn't always well tolerated in people with SIBO early on. How do we determine which prebiotics would be the best support?
I would say all of them. There seems to be a good result by generating variety. In other words, if all you did was one of them, let's say only xylo oligosaccharides, you tend to favor the species that metabolize that fiber specifically at the expense of others. And so you may, in fact, reduce diversity. So the key is variety. So you want to get the fructooligosaccharides and inulin from such things as shallots and garlic and onions and root vegetables. You want to get the galacto-oligosaccharides from legumes and other root vegetables, red beans, kidney beans, black beans, chickpeas, lentils, hummus, those kinds of things. Pectin, like the peel in apples and pears and other things. Hyaluronic acid. Now, most people don't want to eat brain and tongue anymore, so we get it as a supplement. But I think the key is because not all microbes can metabolize every fiber. They tend to favor certain microbes. And so I think the key is, and to make this manageable, what I try to tell people is with every meal, include something fermented. Could be a sip of sparkling juice that you fermented with Bacillus subtilis. It could, and get a fiber. It could be a couple tablespoons of black beans thrown into your morning omelet. Make it real easy. If you make chicken soup, throw in some okra, throw in some chopped onions. Make it very easy. You can buy product, but you don't have to. Products are convenient. The thing I see people do, though, is they buy a product and use only that, and then eat, beef and steak and non-fibrous green vegetables. That's a mistake where you're going to cultivate unhealthy effects. So the key is variety. Do all those things.
So I think people are probably more familiar with the idea of prebiotics and the things that you just talked about. I think maybe we're a little less aware about the role of polyphenols and what that does for the microbiome. So maybe talk to us a little bit about polyphenols, how that supports the microbiome, and then some strategies for incorporating these proliferative polyphenols. Is it usually from food? Is it from supplements? And then my understanding is that a shot of olive oil can provide significant polyphenol support for our biome.
Yeah, I kind of reject this idea we have to do these things that people tell us to do. And rather than just go back to the way grandma used to do it, or people from 10,000, 50,000 years ago, or the way the hunter-gatherers do it. They don't go to the store, buy extra virgin olive oil. I mean, they eat food. They eat wild food. They don't think about fiber content. In other words, this should be almost mindless. We shouldn't have to buy specific products to do this. Now, accepting that modern food is not the same as wild food. But in general, this idea of orchestrating in great detail the kinds of oils you get, I've always kind of rejected that idea. I don't think it's necessary. I think just to return to real food, remove the things that disrupt your microbiome and health. So if we eat foods, choose unprocessed foods. An avocado is pretty close. A piece of salmon is pretty close. Make sure you eat the skin and the fat. A piece of beef, but make sure you eat the fat. Don't get lean cuts. Of course, try to get it free range, etc. And get your polyphenols from food, from peppers, from, yes, extra virgin olive oil. And I don't think we have to purposefully go out and buy quercetin tablets or a polyphenol blend or something like that. I love supplements when they're appropriate and when they fit into an overall program, not because there's some evidence to suggest that something happens when you consume some product.
One of the factors that you talk about in the book that contributes to an unhealthy microbiome is the consumption of emulsifiers, which probably most people don't think about, things like carrageenan, propylene glycol. You also talk about the negative influence of food additives like maltodextrin, which is in so many things. What is it that emulsifiers are doing to our mucus lining? Are they destroying essentially the home for our beneficial floral community? And then kind of extending on that, many of us use sunflower lecithin or soy-derived phosphatidylcholine, which are really the healthy lipids in our cells. Do we need to be concerned at all about the potential role of those types of emulsifiers on the microbiome?
Unfortunately, it's not been fully worked out. There's the best data is Chasang's study where he took polysorbate 80 and carboxymethylcellulose, two emulsifying agents. In other words, things that disperse the mucus barrier. It's kind of like, I tell people, imagine you have a bunch of dirty, greasy dishes in your kitchen sink, and you pour a drop of dishwashing liquid into that oil-covered water. You'll see the oil just disperse. That's what happens with your mucus barrier. So we know what happens with those two, polysorbate 80 carboxymethylcellulose, very common in processed foods, such as ice cream, because they don't want ice cream to thaw and then harden when you refreeze it. Or salad dressings have this. A lot of processed foods have them. The ethylene glycol, that's a great point, because that's the prep used for colonoscopy, horribly. And we know it's extremely disruptive on the mucus barrier. Now, the mucus barrier gets rebuilt continuously, but if you have even minutes to maybe a few hours of dissolution of your mucus barrier, it changes the microbial composition of the GI tract and gives you at least a transient increase in exposure to endotoxemia. No one really knows how bad that's going to be, but it's probably pretty bad. Unfortunately, the carrageenans, the xanthan gums, and so many other products, no one's has looked at that formally. Lecithin, how bad is it? How worried? Nobody knows, Scott. But I would say, in general, try to minimize all those. If you buy an egg, there's natural lecithin in the egg yolk, but there's no added lecithin. If we rely on unprocessed whole foods, we tend to minimize those things.
Many of the organisms within us need a diverse diet, including fibers and polyphenols that you just talked about. What happens to the microbiome when people are on a more restrictive diet, like carnivore or maybe keto long term? Does a less diverse diet lead to a lowered diversity within our microbiome?
Yeah. The evidence is a little bit uneven, but a lot of this has been worked out over a century. So in the diet world, we often lack real science, as does the U.S. government, by the way. They don't have real science either. They think they have science. They have that garbage that comes from the Harvard School of Public Health, but they don't have real science. So in diet, we often don't have good science. The exception is the ketogenic diet, because as you recall, it's been used for about a century in children with intractable grand mal seizures. And it works. It reduces seizure frequency maybe 50%. The kids aren't cured, but they have a reduction in seizure frequency, because these kids are having 5-10 seizures a day, and it causes brain damage, and it's terrifying. Well, what happens to those kids? Now, early on, they used a corn oil-rich diet, which is bad, the corn oil. More recently, using things like coconut oil, MCTs, and others. But what happens to those kids on ketogenic diets? They stop growing. They have big uptick in calcium, oxalate, and uric acid kidney stones. These are kids. Kids aren't supposed to get kidney stones. They have occasional cardiomyopathies and occasional sudden cardiac death. They have a reduction in bowel flora diversity and have problems with constipation and some other things. And there's more recent evidence to suggest there's also, so what those diets do essentially is deprive the microbiome of fibers. And so there's a die-off of microbes dependent on those fibers. If you chain your dog in the backyard and you don't feed it, it's going to die. If you don't feed the microbes in your GI tract, they're going to die. So many species rely on fibers, die. And then something peculiar happens. There are those species like Akkermansia that can survive on human mucus. Akkermansia mucinophila, mucus lover, and Akkermansia and some other species overproliferate wildly. So Akkermansia is beneficial if you keep it at about 5% of the overall microbiome. But if you deprive yourself of fibers, as you might in a ketogenic or overly enthusiastic ketogenic or carnivorous diet without fibers, it goes up to 18%, 24%, 36%, and it consumes your human mucus, which is a very bad situation. You can get ulcerative colitis or other forms of colitis. You can get small intestinal inflammation, and you get a big uptick in endotoxemia. And I believe this is the explanation for why people say this. They say, I did great. I went keto. I lost 47 pounds. My triglycerides dropped from 350 to 48. My blood glucose went from pre-diabetic to 80s. My blood pressure is now normal. My waist shrunk, and they're doing great. But about 18 months in, they say, my blood glucose is creeping back up. I regained 22 pounds. In other words, a lot of things come back, and people will accuse them of not sticking to the diet. And they say, but I am. That, I think, is this disruption in the microbiome.
So let's dig in a little bit then into Akkermansia, this mucin layer that really is protective. It's kind of a home for our microbes. So if we want a healthy microbiome, we also need to have the healthy mucin layer as well. I'm wondering, is the mucin layer different from a biofilm, or can we think of it as a health supporting biofilm that really is the home for our beneficial flora? And then I want to extend on that and talk a little bit about a supplement that many people are taking long term, which is NAC, that can have biofilm breaking properties. But my understanding is that we maybe need to be a little cautious because could NAC also degrade the mucin layer that we so desperately need for our biome?
Yeah, so mucin, of course, as you know, Scott, you're a pretty sharp guy, is the primary protein in the mucus barrier. And we need the mucus barrier. It is absolutely essential. If you didn't have mucus, you would die or get very, very ill very quickly. There are animal models that can't produce mucus and they get very sick and die young. And so we do need that mucus barrier. The two-layer mucus barrier in the colon, the single-layer thinner mucus barrier in the small intestine. Of course, mucus is everywhere. It's in your airway, it's in your sinuses, in your mouth, it's in your colon, it's everywhere. So we don't want things that disrupt it or want to minimize our exposure to those kinds of things. Now, there are things that disrupt it. Those emulsifier agents we talked about. And we don't want to introduce things that we're told are good for us that are not. Ethylene glycol, the Miralax people use for the prep for your colonoscopy. Yeah, nightmare. People are and they even given it chronically for constipation. And they become dependent on it and they get very sick because the gastroenterologist did not recognize, they should be the first to recognize, but they don't recognize that they've given something that's very toxic because it emulsifies the mucus barrier. Now, in the hospital, if you have cystic fibrosis, or COPD or other lung conditions, there's a process called mucus plugs. And all that means is your mucus becomes very thick and it plugs up your airways and you can get essentially an abscess, a pneumonia abscess behind it. It's very tough to take care of. You sometimes have to have it open resection, surgical. And so the agent given in that situation is N-acetylcysteine as an aerosolized preparation because it's very good. Ask any ICU nurse how good is NAC or we call it mucomist treatments. It's very helpful. It breaks up the mucus because it's a potent emulsifier. So people are saying things like, take NAC as a precursor for the antioxidative glutathione. What they're telling you, it's like the people with the ethylene glycol. Take the ethylene glycol because it makes you go number 2. Well, that doesn't make any sense. Right? It's destructive. So the NAC is very destructive, and people are taking it chronically. They should not. You can take it briefly if you have H. pylori, for instance, and it's sequestered in its own biofilm, not the mucus barrier, but its own unique biofilm, or you have maybe SIBO or CFO, where the fungi are sequestered and hidden, protected in their own very tough biofilm. You can use NAC maybe for 10 days, 14 days, something like that. And at least with H. pylori in the stomach, it increases efficacy of the antibiotic regimen by about 10%. We don't know how much it adds to SIBO or CFO because we don't know how far down it goes. But you should not take it chronically because it emulsifies the mucus barrier.
As you mentioned, Akkermansia muciniphila is a mucus lover. It needs prebiotics to really support a healthy Akkermansia population. And when our levels are too low, as you mentioned, it can eat or survive on our own mucus lining. So wondering, what are some of the favorite prebiotics of Akkermansia? What are some of the tools we can use to increase it? And then really, most of us probably now know about Akkermansia because we see so many products on the market. So if we already have high levels of Akkermansia or don't know what our levels are, and we're now taking lots of Akkermansia probiotics, could we potentially be damaging our mucin layer if we don't need the Akkermansia?
Yeah, I worry about that, Scott, because there's a company who came out. So Akkermansia cannot be cultivated as yogurt because it dies upon exposure to air. So this company, polysaccharide encapsulate, I talked to their chief scientist. And by the way, I asked him, I bought one of the bottles for $196 a month's worth. And I said, hey, Dr. Coulterman, nice guy. He's now retired. I said, how many CFUs, how many counts per capsule? His, well, somewhere between 1 and 100 billion. telling us that the process, at least back a few years ago when I talked to him, wasn't sorted out properly. And so, and I also asked that company, why would somebody take it if 95% of people already have it? Why not just bloom it, right? And they said, well, not everybody. We think it's less than that. So there's some uncertainty here. But I have a problem charging people that kind of money to bloom a microbe you may already have. And that in some case may even be detrimental. So that I have some problems with that. But the way to, if you have Akkermansia, if you did a stool analysis and it says you have Akkermansia, or it might be called Verrucomicrobia also. That's the phylum. There's only one member of the Verrucomicrobia, so it's got to be Akkermansia. Just get more inulin, FOS, fructooligosaccharides, to some degree, galacto-oligosaccharides, hyaluronic acid, great bloomer. The oleic acid, fatty acid of extra virgin olive oil helps. And the pectin helps. In other words, there's a variety of things that bloom Akkermansia. And you should enjoy 5% plus whatever of your entire microbiome being Akkermansia. Now, the funny thing is, so Patrice Canny and his group, they were the discoverers of Akkermansia, I think in 2001 in Belgium. And they've been also working on a way to coat the Akkermansia. To my knowledge, I haven't come out with that. But then they did something extraordinary. They killed it. They killed the Akkermansia and compared the effects on glucose tolerance. And to everyone's great surprise, dead Akkermansia outperformed live Akkermansia. And that's why you see now, because the big hurdle was coating it to protect from air. Well, now, if dead Akkermansia works, all these companies have come out with dead Akkermansia. Now, that probably doesn't cause overproliferation, so it's probably a safer way. But Akkermansia live also does have benefits. So I'm not so sure it's the best solution, but that's why those companies are doing it.
So talk to us then for a moment about how we build a healthier mucin layer. What are some of the tools that create that healthy home for our beneficial flora? You talk in the book about your clove green tea and how that could support both Akkermansia, but also the mucin layer, maybe even olive oil again, and that hydroxytyrosol could play a role as well. How are we building a healthier mucin layer?
Fermented foods are really helpful there, as are all the things we talked about, the restoration of keystone microbes, prebiotic fibers, all those things, ways to bloom Akkermansia, all those help. The reason I came with that little recipe, painfully simple, for clove green tea, was really as kind of a near-term strategy. As you know, Scott, a lot of people are hurting. They're saying, I can't sleep. I've had gas and bloating and diarrhea. I've had an endoscopy. I've had a colonoscopy 3 times. And the gastroenterologist says, all in your head, or there's nothing wrong with you, or get an antidepressant, or some other garbage solution. And yet there's clearly something wrong. So as someone starting all these things, the fermented foods, the keystone species, the yogurts, the fibers, if they need near-term relief, I came up with this very simple idea. Let's restore this thing called clove green tea. So we boil the cloves and you mobilize the eugenol essential oil, which increases the thickness of the mucus barrier, at least transiently. We do it with green tea, and if you have the right green tea, the epigallocatechin and other catechins cross-link those mucin proteins, and it tends to convert your mucus barrier from a semi-liquid to a semi-gel. And then we throw in the inulin FOS to bloom Akkermansia, because when Akkermansia is properly managed in the presence of fibers and not ketogenic carnivore diets, it tends to produce and stimulate mucus production rather than consume mucus. And people sip that tea maybe a couple times a day, and it's incredibly soothing. People say, I feel better. It's not meant for chronic consumption. You probably could, but it was meant to be kind of a near-term strategy for relief.
I've seen many people with high levels of akkermansia that were not using any exogenous akkermansia products, multiple sclerosis. There's some research around that. I think some people then conclude that the high levels of akkermansia cause multiple sclerosis. But my understanding is that that could potentially be a beneficial response to a disease process, and that the akkermansia may be overgrowing to reduce inflammation in the gut, in the body, in the brain. Wondering what your thoughts are when you see high levels of akkermansia, and in those cases, should we do something to lower them, or do we trust the body's innate wisdom?
Don't know. So, one of the great problems in much microbiome science is that much of the evidence is observational. It's not interventional. It's just like dietary advice. In other words, how did the USDA and all those other agencies come up with dietary advice? They say, okay, Scott, what did you eat for breakfast on Monday? You say, I had a bowl of oatmeal. I'm just making it up. Bowl of oatmeal and skim milk and a banana. What'd you have for lunch? Well, I was working. I ate at my desk. I had a bologna sandwich on rye with mustard and a bowl of chicken soup. What'd you have for dinner? And you do that over 5 days. I contact you in 10 years. I say, Scott, what's become of you? Have you had colon cancer or heart disease? And then we try to associate that 5-day snapshot of diet with the eventual development of some health problems. Now, wait a minute. In those 10 years, you got divorced. You binge drank. You went on a cleanse. You gained 30 pounds twice and lost it. You had a problem teenager and was stressed to the max. And your mom got dementia and you had to take it. In other words, how can you possibly relate an outcome 10 years later with what you did? That's observational data. But I tell you that because it highlights how lousy observational data can sometimes be. Yet it's the basis for dietary guidelines, the American Heart Association diet, Academy of Nutrition Dietetics program. All these things are based on lousy observational data. Well, the problem with a lot of these studies is they're observational, and we can't necessarily say cause and effect. So we have to construct some kind of a study where we intervene. Let's say you and I had an antidote to akkermansia. We give a bunch of people placebo versus active treatment, and we see if we reduce akkermansia, let's just say from 18% of total microbiome to, let's say, 5%, and something good happens or something bad happens. That's what you'd have to do. But how do you do that? No one knows yet. So it's a problem not unique to akkermansia, Scott. It's a problem that plagues the whole microbiome world.
To learn more about today's guest, visit williamdavismd.com. That's williamdavismd.com. williamdavismd.com. You'll also find the links to the products we discussed in the show notes. And don't forget to watch part 2 of our talk in episode 214. Thanks so much for listening to today's episode. If you're enjoying the podcast, please leave a positive rating or review, as doing so will help the show reach a broader audience. To support the show, visit betterhealthguy.com/donate. To get my newsletter, visit betterhealthguy.com/newsletters. To follow me on Facebook, Instagram, X, or TikTok, you can find me there as Better Health Guy. This and other episodes can be found on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube, and Odyssey.
Thanks for listening to this Better Health Guy blogcast with Scott, your Better Health Guy. To check out additional shows and learn more about Scott's personal journey to better health, please visit betterhealthguy.com.